And we are live, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, geeks of all persuasions and ages. Welcome to another Geek Book Club, the show What Books Read Geeks do monthly. And that's exactly what we do. We pick a book once a month, we read it, we talk about it. You guys can join the conversation. You can tweet at us, you can Instagram at us, join us in the live chat for whenever we broadcast these live. I am, of course, joined by my lovely co-host, Mr. Andrew Wallace. How's it going, sir?
Well, it's going pretty good, sir. Just I am hella excited to talk some Star Trek with you.
I feel like we've gone far too long to not have some public discussion of the fandom that I feel we both share the most in, which is, of course, the Trek. I am being a terrible Star Trek fan in that I could not find my command uniform shirt. I know it's in a box.
No. Well, I mean, being Starfleet officers from the 24th century, we really naturally should blend in with the 21st century culture.
That's right. That's right. So instead, I'm just wearing my original Trek original logo shirt.
Yeah, it's plausible deniability for the people of this time period.
Right. So. I sadly I couldn't find anything. There was a part of me that kind of wanted to show up in the Millennium Falcon T-shirt that I've got.
Oh God, that's a good T-shirt though.
Oh, it's a great T-shirt, but I was like, I don't think I could stoop that low.
Well, no, I did go to Infinity War wearing an Aquaman shirt.
Right on. See, yeah, my wife would have applauded that. She was not on board Infinity War and Thanos, and she did not enjoy that storyline. But again, she's also not really enjoyed any of the DC films either. We've already got the show up and running. We've got a couple people tweeting at us and then joining the live chat. Stephanie Carlson, of course, he's wearing the shirt. Of course, he's wearing the uniform shirt. We all know Andrew. We all love Andrew. But both of us came prepared, though. You're going dual phaser.
Yes, indeed. I found these and they both. Wait, hold on. Oh, that one partially works, and then this one works too. So I'm all set.
I don't know. I mean, somehow you became the warrior class in our because I'm only doing phaser and tricorder. Because I thought you.
I majored in tactical operations at Starfleet Academy.
Okay. I kind of feel like, maybe you shouldn't be wearing the red shirt is all I'm saying. Is if you're dual phaser dude, even Worf only needed the one phaser to get around.
That's true.
I guess I'll be like an operations guy or a science guy or something. I'll back you up with my one phaser.
You're more of a Picard, and I'm more of a Jellicoe or
I love it. Okay, folks. I mean, we've been teasing this out long enough. We are coming back to my childhood. We're revisiting a book that I thought was awesome sauce when I was younger. This is the 1991. So 11-year-old Juan thought this was the most amazing piece of science fiction literature he had ever read. This is Star Trek Vendetta, the giant novel. Okay, keep holding that book up. I'm going to cut to you, Andrew. Again, the title of the book is Star Trek The Next Generation Vendetta, the giant novel.
Yeah, and I never really came across any other books that were called the giant novel, even though it's number 2. Apparently, officially on Memory Alpha and Memory Beta.
Yeah. No, but so there was a whole class. I mean, whenever you have a popular fiction movie series or TV show or something like that, there's always going to be sort of an expanded universe of books or comics, cartoons. You always try and milk a franchise for as much as you can. And so there was a collection of these Star Trek pocket novels. And they were shorter. I mean, almost episode length reads. Much shorter, extra adventures that the Enterprise crew could go on. But this one was real big. This was a 500-page novel.
Really, it was 400
pages.
It's 400 pages exactly.
400 pages exactly. So 400 pages, giant novel.
Yeah.
So this is an exciting one for me to come back to, because I like these kinds of conversations about, like, can you go home again? what I thought was amazing when I was a kid. Could I pick this book back up, and would I still enjoy it, or would I enjoy it despite some flaws, or would I just make fun of it the whole time? And I mean, like, not to get to the end of the book or in any of our review or anything, but I really did enjoy this read, and it comes from Peter David, who has a rich history with the Star Trek brand and with science fiction and comics in general. So, I was happy, and I don't know, because Andrew, I'm throwing my childhood in your face. You weren't a fan of these like pocket novels and stuff. It just like did it at least give you a Star Trek fix? Did it at least get you back into?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's so side bit with this. So this book basically combines, it's kind of a sequel to the original series Doomsday Machine, which had the giant flying space cigar that ate planets. Well, that's my favorite episode of the original series, it turns out. And so finding out that there was an epic crossover, I mean, that was a recipe for success anyway. Peter David really has the character. Yes. And also, side note with this, when this was originally made, when they made the prop for this Planet Killer, it's a windsock that was dipped into concrete.
Yeah, because that totally sounds like the imaginative budget of the original Star Trek series. You have literally 73 cents to make a doomsday machine that eats planets, and go.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, this thing was scary looking when I was little, because I was born in 87. So gosh, when this book came out in 91, I know I was pretty young, so I didn't really I missed some of the golden era of pocket novels for Peter David anyway, because he did Imzadi and several other books.
Yeah, and I read basically all of them. And it's funny that you should also bring up Imzadi, because I have my own personal history with the Star Trek as romance story between Riker and Troy. But we're not talking about that one. We're talking about the cool Borg action today. With again.
Well, I was gonna say, so around 11 years old was when you were exposed to Peter David's work in Vendetta and some of his pocket novels. Oddly enough, I was exposed to some of his work at around the same age with Space Cases on Nickelodeon, which was basically Star Trek for kids.
Right,
it was terrible. It had the Black Ranger from Power Rangers, and it had Jewel State from Firefly. She was the Saturn girl with the rainbow hair.
Oh man, that's taking me back. I see. Okay, I didn't know Peter David.
He was a co-creator of that show.
That's hilarious
with Bill Mummy. So yeah, I've been a fan of Peter David's work even before I fully realized it was Peter.
Well, that's actually really cool, because I mean, like, his writing credits bounce back and forth between like some of the schlock and kid sci-fi to some pretty
Babylon 5.
Well-respected. Babylon 5, exactly. Some really high concept or at least hard science fiction. I finally got his page to load up. When I wanted to screen share, Google likes to shut down all of my web browsers, so nothing works for a minute. His work in comics, he wrote for The Incredible Hulk, Aquaman, Young Justice, Supergirl, Spider-Man 2099, and X Factor. So he's definitely been around there. And then for TV, Babylon 5, then Ben 10, Alien Force, Young Justice, and as you mentioned, Nickelodeon Space Cases, which he was a co-creator on also. Really, really great pedigree here for science fiction discussion. And someone who I feel like takes ownership of this world. This story, the story Vendetta that we're going to be talking about in this podcast. At some point, we'll eventually actually start talking about the book. It's definitely sort of a what if storyline. It takes place as if it were canon in a way where it could absolutely never be canon. And he absolutely owns what happens to the characters in the story, the setting, the backdrop of this story, what happens to Starfleet, what happens to the Borg. He makes some very bold commitments to these characters in a way that it feels very authentic to Next Generation Trek. But again, it's like the second you put the book down, you're like, well, I know what happened, so that wasn't what happened, but it feels like it could have happened.
Oh yeah, absolutely. When apparently going into my research, a lot of these books have a continuity with each other, which is actually interesting, which is pretty nice. Because with Star Wars, you can kind of get some stuff all over the place, and it can be kind of a Wild West.
Yeah, it almost feels like these could have been, the exploits of the Excelsior Crew, right? Not the flagship of the Federation, but like the B team.
Well, and some characters. What was it? One of the Starfleet captains in this story shows up in one of Peter David's New Frontiers books. Well, sort of. Yeah,
well,
but we'll get into that. Yeah,
and I also want to say, I mean, like as we're going through the discussion of this book, Peter David was well on the pulse for where Star Trek would end up, where the Next Generation would end up, where Voyager would end up, and where canon would go. He was just about, 7 years ahead of the curve, 6 years ahead of the curve for some of these things.
That's ironic because he wrote a sequel to this book, and it's generally been not very well reviewed.
Yeah,
and it's been hypothesized that he was put in a position where he didn't really want to write it, and it kind of became a representation of his frustrations with what he viewed Voyager and Star Trek franchise becoming. So it's ironic then in that case that like he kind of foretold some of that and then ended up
also criticized it at the same time
in the sequel. So
I mean, it's super meta. So the story of Vendetta centers around, I mean, you might have guessed, this is a Next Generation timeline story. Captain Picard, Commander Riker, Lieutenant Commander Data, Worf, Geordi, Troy, Beverly Crusher. It's the Enterprise D. Shortly after, not too long after the events of the season 3 cliffhanger, still regarded, I think, as one of the most amazing television moments of all time. Before we had bingeable content, Netflix streaming content, before every single series like lived and died by these cliffhangers, trying to keep the audience hooked into what was going to happen, we had the Best of Both Worlds parts 1 and 2. They tour around infrequently, but if you like Star Trek at all, there are occasionally movie screenings of the Best of Both Worlds. And so they will put both episodes back to back, and you sit and you eat movie theater popcorn. The score for those 2 episodes is phenomenal. I had the pleasure, I want to say it was about 4 years ago, of getting to sit in one of these screenings where it was for the release of one of the remastered Blu-rays or something like that. Got to sit down in the theater, Best of Both Worlds. I'm surrounded by the most diehard of diehard Trek fans, and it was phenomenal. So much better watching the Best of Both Worlds in not a true widescreen presentation, in like a 90s television presentation. It was so much more fun than watching any like J.J. Abrams Trek. It is
I bet.
epic. It's so great. So shortly after that, so in that storyline, obviously Captain Picard was captured by the Borg, became Locutus. The Enterprise rescues Captain Picard, gets all the Borg stuff off of him, and they defeat the Borg in the end because of really cool science fiction plot device escapism. So Vendetta actually plays with different elements of Picard's history before we actually got to see some of that stuff later on in the run of the Next Generation. So the story starts out with Picard at Starfleet, and Peter David wasn't necessarily right in his portrayal of young Picard, but he got really close.
Yeah, well, here's the weird thing about it. So the way Peter David depicts young Picard, he's very kind of straight-laced and very serious. What you would, if you hadn't watched to a certain point in season 2 of TNG, you would probably expect Picard to be kind of that straight-laced, go, by the book sort of cadet. And it's a little weird because even before Peter David wrote this book, they kind of established that he was kind of a rebel sort of character when he in his youth, before he got stabbed in the back by a Nausicaan. So it's interesting that that Peter David kind of misinterpreted it a little, but it works for the story, and especially for how it coats how. Okay, Picard meets someone in his that is a major part of the story.
Let's actually get into the story. So it's Picard at Starfleet, and he's got a rivalry with another cadet. This other cadet is a little more Kirk-like, a shoot from the hip. He's a little cooler. He's a little more fun. And Picard in this story is portrayed as being very straight-laced, very by the book, the rules, analytical and cerebral. And this is where Peter David gets the portrayal of young Picard not quite right, because we know old Picard as being very more of an ambassador type of figure who can also, turn to the big guns when he needs to, but he's not a Kirk type. And later in the run of the Next Generation, young Picard is portrayed as a lot younger and more reckless, a lot more fiery and passionate. So the book starts with Picard and Starfleet as they're going through a history lesson about the original Enterprise, as captained by James Tiberius Kirk, encountering the planet Killer. And Picard is being distracted by these visions of a woman that is walking through the halls of Starfleet Academy. And he has other cadets like looking for this woman because he feels like this could be a security breach or someone could be trying to infiltrate Starfleet Academy, and they can't find any evidence of it. So they finally get to class, and the teacher is very frustrated with Picard, and he starts asking questions about, well, what is this planet Killer, and what do we think, and what's the analysis on this? And Picard makes a very astute observation about the origin of the planet Killer from the original series. This is one of the faults I have with the book right at the top, is that Star Trek canon always feels very small because of the fan service of linking to our most favorite episodes.
Oh, and some of our not favorite episodes.
And some of our not very favorite episodes too.
So a little key insight on this. Just the Doomsday Machine, I guess, we're gonna have some spoilers kind of going forward.
Totally.
Yeah. The Doomsday Machine was created by a race called the Preservers, which are referenced, I guess it's unefficially.
Yeah, I don't believe this is quite canon, but
right. Yeah, this one especially because there was some sort of legal dispute about this being canon, which we can get into in here in a little bit as well. But like the Preservers built the Doomsday Machine to fight the Borg. Well, I did some diving in, I didn't dive in to Wikipedia. I went to Memory Alpha and then Memory Beta, which is the unofficial wiki for Star Trek. And so
we went down this journey for you, listeners and viewers. We went down this journey for you.
And so they ended up, the Preserver race also, it turns out, took Native Americans from ancient Earth and then deposited them on the planet where Kirk ends up becoming Kirok. I am Kirok. So that's the level of how they do this fan service in these books, how the universe feels tiny.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of these things tie together. Every character who's not from the Enterprise is immediately like one step removed from the TV show in an episode that you've already liked, especially characters that are already in Borg featured episodes like The Best of Both Worlds. So like Commander Shelby has to make a return. Dr. Pulaski makes a return.
Well, and we got what's his face, Commander Hobson, the guy who was a dick to Data in that one random episode, Redemption, and it looks like he got demoted, which is great.
So funny. So again, I mean, like all of these things feel very, very, very small. So anyway, Picard sees this woman. They can't find her. He finally gets back to class. They're talking about the planet Killer. He makes an observation about where he thinks the planet Killer came from, and it had to have come from outside of our galaxy. And Star Trek has this silly thing of like there's a galactic barrier, like the edge of our galaxy has a wall of energy that's really difficult to get through,
right? Even though it should technically be like a sphere, you would think, or something.
Yeah, and like if we did, then we probably wouldn't be able to see other galaxies.
Right.
Right. So again, Star Trek is dumb there, but we still love it. They get so many other things like hard science fiction-y, and that's fine. But Star Trek still does like treat a lot of space travel as being two-dimensional. You know, like, well, you go forwards and backwards and side to side, and you're fine.
Especially in the 60s. TOS,
especially in the 60s,
it's treated like that. So, and that's part of some of the weakness of this book as we're going through and it's merging those two continuities. Is it's even though they're part of the same overall continuity, it's difficult merging the absolute crazy cheesiness of the original series with looking back now, TNG is still cheesy too, but it is markedly less cheesy to a degree. I mean, you're not going to have an episode like Spock's brain in TNG, but you get close with Code of Honor.
Yeah.
So it makes it fun and interesting. But Peter David knows enough about the characters as we're progressing through and knows enough about the intricacies and what motivates each character and how and treats the relationships between our beloved characters appropriately, I feel.
Yeah. So Picard makes this observation, and then that night he's visited by the mysterious vanishing woman who he sort of falls in love with, but not really.
Yeah, that's another part where that's weak with this book is like, the whole love relationship, and because the book starts out when we meet up with the Enterprise crew, it's with Data and Geordi in the holodeck, acting out
Don Quixote,
and
La Mancha,
right, and Picard and this woman that Picard has visions of is basically his Dulcinea. Yeah, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Which Peter David totally nails that, like,
yes.
We're going to introduce an idea from classical literature, which is going to be the metaphor for a relationship that's going to play out later in the show.
And they bookend it, and it feels just like an episode the way they treat it.
It totally does. Again, and he perfectly captures that kind of Star Trek historical soap boxing and you need to be a little more erudite to get all the references in Star Trek. Occasionally, we'll talk about Shakespeare. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is great. So, he's visited by a mysterious woman. Young Picard totally, becomes all Twitter-pated for her. But then fast forward to modern day Star Trek Next Gen, 24th century Star Trek, in Captain Picard. But we open on a planet. And I loved the description of the planet getting attacked.
Yes,
that was was it the Panzotti?
Yes,
is that an Italian dish?
And if anyone remembers, because there's kind of a difference, they kind of reimagined the Borg slightly between the TV show and First Contact and Voyager and everything that came after First Contact. Well, and before, whenever the Borg would come and assimilate society, they basically just scoop up their cities.
Yeah,
with a tractor beam and just take them, and it very much goes, instead of like being zombies, essentially like they did later. That really, because we never saw it in the show. We saw the effects of it as a matte painting, but they just it was a wonderfully thrilling sequence and a great way to introduce the one Panzotti character, that recurring Panzotti character in this novel.
Yeah,
that has.
Absolutely agree, because we made the Borg a lot less scary. There's something more terrifying about the Borg in Best of Both Worlds when you only see the aftermath, and it's up to the viewer's imagination to think, like, what would it have been like as we're looking at like chunks of where a city used to be that look like the Grand Canyon, right? Like,
right.
That's how devastating the Borg were. But then when we finally did get to showing more Borg action combat in First Contact later, or just later in the Next Generations run, it's way less scary than that. It just looks like ships and laser beams. It's like every other space combat adventure kind of thing. The Borg were so much more menacing, and Peter David, I think, did a great job of capturing just a little bit of how terrifying that experience would be. Or drones beaming down to the surface, giant chunks of your city getting pulled up into the atmosphere. A character describing like getting to the edge of space as his air is starting to be ripped from his lungs.
Little details like that. just the little details make it just stick out in your head, and just you could just vividly picture it.
Oh yeah. And that this was, thanks to my imagination going a little dark, hand in hand with Peter David describing terrible atrocities and like watching his children getting murdered by a Borg drone smashing the skull of his daughter. Like, okay, the Borg feel like a real threat, like a real menace to this magic society with faster than light travel and teleportation and energy beam weapons and quantum torpedoes. Like, this looks like something scary when we describe what the Borg are capable of. Of course, in the midst of this attack, a mysterious ship arrives and blasts a Borg cube from space with very little trouble.
Right. Well, and there during this time, during the story, I still didn't fully know, because you didn't like say outright to me that this was the Doomsday Machine. So as soon as I saw whatever character described what the beam that was attacking the Borg is, pure anti-proton. I was like, oh, my God, yes, the ultimate crossover novel.
I thought you'd get a kick out of that. See, I didn't know that your favorite episode was the Doomsday Machine, but I thought you'd just like get a kick out of the fact that this is like season 1 or season 2 Star Trek at its best, where they're really not great stories, but they're trying so hard to rip off what we liked about the original series. Right? The same sort of morality tales. There's a lot of magic in space before Star Trek starts to become a little bit more hard-edged in terms of science.
I'd be willing to argue that this is better than season 1 for sure.
I'd say it's in that same vein of Star Trek The Next Generation couldn't really exist in those first 2 seasons without constant callbacks, references, and plot lines that were totally pulled from the original series. And this feels like the culmination of that kind of Star Trek just finding its own footing, just finding its own real villain. It's not the Klingons. It's not the Romulans. The Ferengi didn't do anything for us. They weren't scary at all. It's only when Star Trek The Next Generation found the Borg that I felt like the show really grew into its own. And this was like the last baton pass. If this had been an episode of the show, it would have felt to me like, okay, now the show's properly grown up. And while we acknowledge that it's continuity, we don't need to keep calling back everything to the original series.
Yeah, I mean, this is a much better baton pass than Generations was. So, I mean, by far.
Oh, totally. I mean, this does. I mean, if it had been an episode, I think Peter David wrote something so interesting here. If it had been an episode, I would have put it up there with Relics.
Oh, yeah.
I love Relics. Again, mysterious thing. We don't know where it came from. There's kind of a mystery, but in the midst of this mystery, we actually have a bigger problem of survival, and we're all going to work together to get out of this problem. And other people will have to examine the mystery. Sometimes, as the explorers, you don't get answers. And Relics is that kind of wonderful story. This gives us answers to the Doomsday Machine, which the original series, there's something so haunting and so chilling about. You don't know what's out there in space. It's kind of like being afraid of sharks in the ocean. Like anything could be lurking out there, and you don't know where it's from or what its motivations are. You can't reason with it. Maybe you're not advanced enough to communicate with it, or maybe you're too advanced to communicate with it. And it's more than just like probe looking for some whales, you know?
Right. Yeah. It is much deeper, and it's nice too because the Peter David really harvests and takes advantage of the rich lore of Trek up until at this point up until the middle of season 4. For example, so this woman we eventually discover that the person who is in contact with, who is controlling the Doomsday Machine, is, of course, this woman that Picard's seen in her past. Well, Guinan is brought in, and Guinan, we haven't at this point fully established the Guinan's character. We've had her for a couple of seasons, but we haven't gotten into the origin. They hadn't even written the origins of Picard meeting Guinan. So it was really nice to have some sort of an open canvas for Guinan with it, and don't really feel it broke later canon really that much either. But so it turns out Guinan knew this woman. What was her name? It was
I have it on my Kindle. What was the name again?
Delcara. Yeah, Delcara. And she was a sister of sorts. Basically, her origin story is so her race were assimilated. She's the last of her race that was assimilated by the Borg, and then she drifted and ended up with the Elorians, Guinan's race, and then
they get wiped out by the Borg.
And then they get wiped out. And so she has an Ahab complex with the Borg, essentially. And she goes and
little elements of First Contact.
Mm-hmm. And it's not Picard who's irrational this time, even though, okay, I do love First Contact. But
I am in with First Contact. I kind of feel like the next gen movies rewrite elements of the main characters' personalities that.
Oh yes, I mean
Picard from the movie does not resemble Picard from the TV show, but it's Patrick Stewart, so I still love both. But they feel different.
Well, and there are other things that help save that movie too, like the score, and totally. It's all in the fact that it's better than Generations, Insurrection, and Nemesis.
Yeah, well, we should table this. Just because this is the first time we've talked about Star Trek doesn't mean it should be the last time. So let's not.
That's true.
Let's try and stay focused on the book and not express all of our feels for all of Star Trek in one evening's conversation. So Delcara is obsessed with trying to end the Borg's existence, with trying to rid the universe of this plague. And she also believes herself to be cursed. So she also can't become attached to anyone. She can't relate to anyone because she believes, if I do, then the Borg are just going to kill them too. So in this experience where she was floating through the halls of Starfleet Academy, because Guinan's people and Delcara's people have these sort of the sense of the universe and timeline and continuity, she had the feeling that something very important was going to happen there. That's why she was in Starfleet Academy. And so for Picard's utterance that the Doomsday Machine had to have come from outside of our galaxy leads her on a quest to find the origin of that machine. And then she eventually finds the completed machine. And that's where we discover that the Doomsday Machine from the original series was an incomplete weapon, a prototype weapon that was going to be sent after the Borg, and that the race that had created it had almost finished a much more advanced and much more powerful weapon. And that's what Delcara discovers just outside the galactic barrier of our galaxy.
Well, and the race that created these basically pour their consciousness / souls / open to interpretation into the control, essentially into the machine. They have to have a pilot, but they basically almost merge into one. You know, not really Tin Man-esque, but essentially,
but not dissimilar. Again, that we're talking about. What I like about Star Trek is even when they try and portray a technology as magic, that they at least still give it some kind of grounding in other established Trek lore. And for the Doomsday finished weapon, the finished version that Delcara is piloting, it doesn't seem like that's way off the mark. If you had a civilization that was that advanced, that could create these amazingly powerful machines, that was a contemporary of the Borg from where the Borg were, and the Borg assimilated their technology to become as powerful as they did, that the notion of like a collectivist memory computer interface would kind of make sense. Peter David writes a lot about, oh, well, it's the emotions and the feelings and the memories that are powering this thing. But why wouldn't you also try and just back up your species consciousness? You know, if you had the technology to do that, so that you weren't completely wiped from the face of the universe. I've already forgotten the name of the episode, and I was going to reference this, where Captain Picard lives an entire lifetime.
Inner light.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, like, again, if older technologies that weren't really spacefaring could pull that off, I really believe that a more advanced civilization could do that, and then that would become the interface in the computer system for this massive weapon. And it would also make sense that the only person who could pilot it would also be someone as dedicated to the cause of trying to eliminate the Borg.
Well, and it's interesting too, because the way they depict there's the others, like, or the children, or other, there are a couple of different names they use for the collective consciousness, plural
consciousnesses is
yeah, plural that's inhabiting the Doomsday Machine. But it's poetic in a way, because they hate the Borg and their vendetta is against the Borg, but that's in harmony with the pilot. They kind of become a collective consciousness, which is exactly what the Borg is.
Yeah.
And so there are many layers to it that really show the futility.
I'm really glad you brought that up. That was going to be something I pointed to later. But so this giant weapon that can destroy Borg cubes without much difficulty. It's like the mirror image Borg. It is exactly, Peter David wrote exactly a species becoming what they hate.
Yep.
So instead of the Borg, where they're cold and calculating, and there's a hive mind that's a centralized computer source, and everyone's a drone, Delcara doesn't have a ton of ships like the Borg. The Borg have a ton of cubes and a ton of drones. It's just this one singular entity, but it's fueled by a singular passion. Mm-hmm. As opposed to the cold calculating logic of the Borg. It's like the perfect mirror image. And as this giant planet killing device is discovered, and just like the original Doomsday Machine, it needs to consume planets, the raw material of large masses in space to power its engines and furnaces and stuff. So, of course, because it's going around consuming planets throughout different solar systems, it is discovered by Starfleet, and Starfleet sends out a ship to try and stop it, which is futile because this thing's crazy powerful to stop the Borg. But that does become that sort of great mirror image, that dichotomy between, the Borg being evil and menacing for one reason, and now Delcara becoming evil and menacing for the opposite reason, and humanity, the Federation, is sort of stuck in the middle.
Right. Well, it's interesting too, because they're menacing. Well, they're menacing on a personal level in many ways too, because in different ways. Because I found some of the really compelling stuff is Delcara's interaction with her children, the voices essentially, and how they're manipulating her and pressuring her in an abusive relationship.
Yeah,
that's really real, and he really sells it really well, and you really do get at least I got a very big sense of a sympathy for Delcara's character, and it's where you rooting for her to get away from this abusive relationship essentially.
Well, and this all just gets tied up. So the Starfleet starts to investigate what happened to this planet where the Borg were scooping up cities, and then they notice that there's Borg debris in orbit around this planet. They do discover this new planet-killing device, and Delcara makes her presence known in a fairly ham-fisted television kind of way, where she just projects her hologram onto the bridge of the Enterprise, and Picard realizes, oh, this is the woman that I saw in my academy days that I thought was just a dream, that I sort of created this ideal woman that I was going to fall in love with in my memories, but she's real, and she's piloting this giant doomsday weapon. Well, there's some conflict there.
And and Peter David got it just right too, because the moment that she appeared on the screen, Worf pulls his phaser and Picard has to deny him. They got it perfect.
Okay, so tell me, like, there were so many moments in this book that I felt like Peter David was either making fun of the characters or didn't quite nail it. Like, there's a lot of snark coming from Geordi about like, repairs and stuff.
Geordi's very combative in this
throughout this whole book, and you're like, okay, well, we know Geordi never got laid during the Next Gen, but I feel he's really taking it out. Not in this book either, but he's really taking it out on his compatriots in this novel. But the one thing that I thought he did get right was it's the continued trend in Next Generation, where no matter what Worf suggests, they always go with the opposite.
It happens so many times in this book. It's glorious.
So funny. Worf will bring up something. You're like, actually, that's a fairly sensible concern, Lieutenant Commander Worf. But no, we're not going to do that. You're like, it's just like the TV show. You can always shoot down Worf.
Yeah, they like the feel of this book is very TNG, where it's just all the little things, and to the point where it's almost like the characters they don't get to the point where characters are caricatures of themselves. They don't really go full Star Trek Into Darkness with the TNG characters in this book, which I am very, very thankful for.
I think they get close with Geordi, but
they close, but like well, it's interesting too, because thinking about the whole Geordi, because we need to introduce this other character that's brought in. They end up finding this Borg drone that they bring aboard, who's separated from the collective, who's not Hugh, and it's a person. I forgot her name. Is it Rand? How do you pronounce her first name? Randy Bonaventure.
Bonaventure, yeah.
Yeah, we're just gonna call her Bonaventure because it's easier that way. Well, there was a whole behind the scenes meta thing with this book where they tried to there was conflict with the idea that there would be a female Borg, even though the Borg assimilate species that have multiple genders. I don't know.
No. Only assimilate men.
Apparently, this was more like the studios.
Now, did you actually? Because Peter David wrote about this in 2000. I
haven't read his. Okay,
this is from peterdavid.net. The 2012 Most Awards, where he's like kind of rectifying his own personal ledger. He's like the most bizarre Usenet discussion. Most aggressive attempt to pick a fight with me, because apparently there's bad blood between Peter David and Kevin Smith because of Peter David's run on Aquaman. Of all the things to fight about, I'm sure Aquaman is high on all of our list of priorities for people to be writing. But this comes from Most Personal Irony. When I wrote a Trek novel called Vendetta in 1991, it featured a female Borg whom the crew of the Enterprise brought aboard the ship and divested of Borg accoutrement, and whose lost humanity they tried to recapture. Although the proposal was initially accepted by Paramount, else the book wouldn't have been written, after the novel was finished, it was rejected by a flunky of Gene Roddenberry's office because we were told there were no such things as female Borg. This seemed preposterous. They assimilated entire cultures, but only the men? Was Borg society based on Orthodox Judaism? The existence of the female Borg seemed a given. Nope, no female Borg. We were told, quote, change it. Was the dictate from the flunky. Well, it was too late to change it. The book was already being typeset. The cover with the female Borg had been printed. So Roddenberry's office insisted upon a disclaimer that read, the plot and background details of Vendetta are solely the author's interpretation of the universe of Star Trek and vary in some respects from the universe as created by Gene Roddenberry. There would have been an audio version of the book, but the audio division wasn't allowed to adapt it because of that disclaimer. Since then, with the introduction of the Borg Queen and Seven of Nine, the universe caught up with the book, but the disclaimer is still carried on the book when it's printed, and fans still ask me about it. And there never was an audio version. Resistance is futile, so is common sense sometimes.
Well, it's crazy. I have a lot of respect for Gene Roddenberry and his legacy because he created something that is such a huge part of my life. However, there were some ideas that came out that came from his direction that were not so great ideas.
Well, and then also I like to this personal account by Peter David. It's also the people that start to take like middle management over ownership over some of
that happened
with Star Trek
a lot. Well, and he died in 1991.
Yeah.
So he had very much hands off at this point because he had other things on his mind, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely. And so I have to believe that the writing of this book probably took place very shortly after The Best of Both Worlds. And this book seems to have been published near the end of season 4 of next June.
Yeah, because I'm pulling up the Netflix
you were saying
series. So I've got all the episodes.
But you were saying it lines up like shortly after Data's Day, right?
Yeah, shortly after Data's Day. I'm trying to think because here's other things, because it has to have taken place after Redemption at some point, because they have Commander Hobson, unless it's a fluke. and they just he shares the guy's last name.
How hilarious would that be if like one of the screenplay writers for Next Gen was like, I need a name for a jerk, Hobson, and like had read the book, and you're like, you know what, we're gonna use that guy. That guy was awesome.
Jerk. If that happened, because that's who I imagined as this being the whiny commander who got demoted to science officer or whatever, for being addicted to data. Yeah. That it didn't break the continuity in the book for me. So, there are so many people like that are in this. Like there are also some side ships. There's the USS Republic and the USS Chekhov, and I believe they're both Excelsior class ships, which makes this even more of a TNG episode since they only had the Excelsior model, so they'd use that for every ship that the Enterprise would meet up, which is perfect for the book.
Totally.
So there's the Captain Corsimo, who is the Captain Kirk equivalent, sort of, except he's kind of an idiot.
Well, he's just supposed to be a bit more headstrong. I didn't mean literally like a Captain Kirk in sort of the guns blazing.
But no, I totally got what you mean. In compared to Picard, especially, yeah, they're kind of opposites. We've got Shelby as the first officer. We've got on the Republic, we've got Catherine Pulaski as the medical officer who went back because they mentioned she came from the Republic at the beginning of season 2, so she went back there. We've got the guy's name Argyle. Whatever. I think that's no. That's essentially there's almost Scotty from the guy who they had. They have him standing in as the chief engineer in season 1 in a couple of episodes with the beard. Like random Dr. Solar. It's crazy how deep they go in to pull these recurring characters.
But don't you think, again, kind of coming to our point, that because we couldn't have an interaction with a character who wasn't already established in some form in the canon, doesn't that kind of make this feel smaller? Like, shouldn't we be able to introduce, like, Starfleet's supposed to be pretty big. Space is not small. That this is the kind of stuff, like, it feels good in the fan servicey way when you're reading it, but it also kind of makes me feel like there are apparently only 30 people in the Star Trek universe.
Well, that's where the whole thing with the Penzotti had a lot of it had a lot of potential, but some of it was wasted because most of the Penzotti stuff was towards the beginning of the book.
And then the first half, very little payoff after that point. Yeah.
Right. And it serves a very specific purpose and a very small and specific purpose towards the end of the book. And it doesn't, while reading through the Penzotti section was great, the buildup wasn't really, it
wasn't realized. I mean, what ultimately becomes of those characters post Borg attack. I mean, again, they're set up to horrify us at the beginning. And then, like you were saying, there's a very specific element. And that to me feels like television writing. If I only had 1 or 2 hours to tell this story, a lot of this book would have been compressed out for TV, and that you only would have had the establishing of this character at the beginning, survivor of this race, the Borg destroyed planet. That's like a parallel with Guinan. And then at the end, he does something which many people would probably be upset about. But that's Star Trek. You'd have that we learned something and we have our feels and we're upset about this, but we persevered over here. But at what cost? Right. That kind of dilemma in Star Trek.
I wonder if he had a paid max page limit, like when he was told.
Apparently, it was 400 because this was a pocket novel, and this was the giant pocket novel.
Right, and so it's like
I almost guarantee you, dude, that when they were going through to do the editing on this, like when it was to the publishers and they were doing the editing, they were like 417 pages. Oh no.
No. We've got to have the 1, 2, 3. We've got to have the 4 pages and the back cover advertising other books. So
we already have the structure of the books created. We just need to fill each individual page exactly that way. But to that same token, this is sort of there's not a very good economy of character building in this story. Like where I've praised other books that they introduce a character and then that character contributes to the story in a meaningful way, and each character gets a little bit of an arc. That doesn't happen here. There are definitely characters that are introduced just for fan service, characters that are just plot devices. But one of the things that I did think was kind of interesting in expanding the scope of this, why this book was so amazing to me when I originally read it was the Borg changing tactics. And so after the first Borg cube is destroyed, they know they have a problem. It's like, we're the Borg. We shouldn't just be blown out of the stars this easily. And so they encounter a Ferengi commander, and they assimilate this Ferengi commander in a side way that they had a spokesperson with Locutus that could interact with humanity. Well, they're hoping to adapt their tactics by assimilating a Ferengi, someone who can make deals, someone who has a keen sense of strategy and of sort of a gambling mentality. And when I vividly remember when the Ferengi were introduced, kind of thinking like, oh, well, what are they going to do? What are they going to be a part of this story? This feels like a bad B plot. But then when the Ferengi commander gets assimilated, like just brain exploding, like with potential, with possibility. Like Locutus was this one thing, and now they're going to try it again, but they're going to do it different. So the Borg are learning and they're adapting, not only adapting in technology, but also adapting in tactics and culture and stuff. And that to me was a very exciting development for how they portrayed the Borg book.
It made me feel like the Borg had never assimilated a Ferengi before. Like because in Voyager you get the feeling that the Borg have been everywhere and done everything, and
again, way less scary when they're just
exactly
around alpha and beta quadrants, and here you get the sense like they are a very rare, a very scarce species in the world of Starfleet. They come from a mysterious place far, far away.
Yeah, well, I will say, as cool as it was to have the Ferengi be assimilated and be kind of a Ferengi Locutus, I will say he has the most fan fiction name ever made. It's Vastator. I'm just reading this and I'm like, is this something like I would have made up when I was 12?
Yeah. It's something I would have made up when I was 12. I would have thought sounded totes badass, and now it's just nothing but cringe. This is Peter
like
David, not
Baldur's Gate. I made,
we were trying to come up with like an awesome sounding, character name for a role playing game. Like, this is not Peter David at his coolest. Coming up with Vastator.
Yeah, but
that doesn't really work.
Yeah, it's. I feel like the Ferengi, like because they kind of had, well, they didn't have to, I guess, but they wanted to have a face for the bad guys. It's the same sort of problem that came later in Star Trek with Star Trek First Contact, where they came up with the Queen, where they wanted to have a face to the Borg threat, and it worked in Best of Both Worlds because it was Picard, the strongest person in the entire series, could succumb to them if he could.
And also it definitely plays into sort of our speciesism. Like for some reason, humanity's special.
Well, right? And it's not so much.
Like you meet that in a science fiction show, like mostly staffed by humans, like in real life.
Think of it this way, though. What if we had the similar sort of story? But what if? I mean, it's characters that we know. I would be more shocked. I would be, or just as shocked, if 6-year-old me would be just as shocked to see Spock be Locutus as Picard.
Well, and then also like the notion of like Vulcans being a part of the Borg collective and what you could glean from them.
Right, and that was never really realized either.
But this is also, I mean, again, you have like power creep, right? In any kind of franchise. We were looking at what's going on with Marvel. It started out as Tony Stark in a cave making a jetpack and a flamethrower, and it ends with the Infinity Gauntlet and galactic powers and the entire population of the entire universe. So we've progressed. It's hard to keep telling impressive stories when really the only goal is to out epic. And I think that does a huge disservice to an antagonist like the Borg. I think the scariest part of the Borg is not being able. It's always the fear of the unknown. It's always going to be that mystery. Where do they come from? What are their motives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the Borg actually return us to a more classical notion of zombieism, And I mean that in the truest sense of the origin of the zombie, not what it became in the 60s with George Romero. So George Romero becomes like shambling corpses, but before then it was more about corruption and
like voodoo.
And voodoo, exactly. Well, the voodoo stories were, I mean, again, a lot of them were exploitation. You know, this powerful black magic is going to subvert your delicate and sensitive, fragile white women. Woo! So, I mean, not that the Borg were racist, not like zombies.
No, they turned everybody stark white. They're the ultimate racists.
Everybody. It's, again, sort of zombie fascists. but there's the thing that I think is really terrifying about the classical notion, the pre-George Romero zombie, is the fact that there's still a piece of you locked away. You are not a true corpse risen. The whole tenets of zombieism are you die a very particular kind of death of your personality and soul, and then what's left of you is controlled by a powerful magician. And that's what the Borg represent. The Borg, and also to the same degree, the Cybermen from Doctor Who.
Yeah, I got very clear. Like, and I'm not as big of a I'm not as well versed in Doctor Who as you are, but I've got a very clear sort of parallel with the way the Borg were portrayed in this book and in the Borg during the show during season 4 and season 5. There was a big link between. I drew a lot of parallels between the Cybermen and with that, and it was very interesting, especially with Bonaventure, the character of Bonaventure, and how, because like if you're hardcore Star Trek fans like us, you know you've already seen 7 of 9 and how multiple people have been brought back from being Borg. Well, with this, it's like they've used you to the point where your mind can't readjust back to, like, in a lot of ways, depending on how long you've been, and they handle it really well, and it's really scary.
Well, and Peter David does something really special here. That Bonaventure was sort of an Amelia Earhart type adventurer, swashbuckler, would go out and fly through dangerous areas of space, and she was a human anomaly in how far out she would travel and what races and cultures and species she would encounter, and she gets assimilated by the Borg earlier than humanity's first encounter with the Borg. So she has been a part of this Borg collective for an extremely long time. When we catch up with this character and they're trying to deborg her, deprogram her, and she can't really be.
Yeah, I mean, even
she can't be reassimilated into human culture. She's almost completely gone.
Yeah, I will say this book, because we have the Penzotti who we have followed through the first part of the book ends up in 10 Forward with Bonaventure as Geordi's trying to help reacclimate her, and the whole subplot with this Penzotti character is that he wants revenge for his family, and so follows one of the best decompression scenes that I imagined in Star Trek, where he shoots at her and ends up blasting a hole in the window in 10 Forward, and nobody dies. But this whole period where she's almost basically sucked out, and her arm is kind of like out the window, and I'm thinking the whole time, what's going to happen when that force field comes up? And lo and behold, I predicted it. Her arm gets sheared off, and there's just blood everywhere that would never be in an episode of TNG. But I was like, dang, this is getting kind of intense, you know.
And again, why 11-year-old Juan loved this. Again, you see there's blood, there's the utter carnage of an entire alien civilization, and some of the characters even say naughty swear words.
Right?
They say some PG-13 words, which you could never get away with on TV.
Oh man, yeah. It would make Data blush.
Although, were you not reading through to see like if they accidentally put in any contractions whenever Data spoke?
Oh my god, I did not find any. But oh man, I was looking out for it though. I was like, okay. I was like, it's my mission to make sure, because I have a couple of separate notes in here about how some continuity doesn't really line up with later on, which we will get to.
But yeah, so I was definitely on high alert for whether or not they were going to be true to that. So, this all culminates again. You've got multiple starship three primary starships flying through space, sort of investigating the destruction left by the Borg, the destruction left by Delcara, and the Enterprise is sort of stuck in the middle. And we have the other Captain Corsmo, was it?
Corsmo.
I didn't know how to pronounce his name.
Yeah, I didn't really. It was one of those names where I was just kind of read through it real quickly and just to kind of
and I flew through this book. I think I read it in a week just because it is such cotton candy.
Oh gosh, I read half of this book in 2 days. I was so absorbed into it.
So we only have a handful of ships, but of course, again, I mean, it's this sort of like, quadrant wide event as they're going through, and there's a big fallout between Corsmo Picard.
Yeah.
So of course Corsmo is very jealous of Picard's career because he was the more exciting cadet, the cadet with more swagger, but Picard ended up on the flagship of the Federation and the hero of all of these amazing stories, the hero of Earth in stopping the original Borg cube that almost wiped out the Federation, and his ship was too far away to have any meaningful interaction with the Borg. But of course, he always imagines that if he had been there, it would have been him who stopped the Borg and not Picard. And I love that in the book, they have Corsmo pull rank. That like, because I'm the senior captain here. And you're like, yeah, wasn't it Picard's line is almost something like, you're a week older than me or something.
Yeah. Well, and Picard, like we get a little bit of channeling of early seasons angry Picard.
Yeah.
Kind of nice because there's a difference because when everyone thinks angry Picard, you think of the films, but no, like you had curmudgeon-y, like short with people Picard, that handled really well, and it was interesting because it was interesting. I really enjoyed reading I was interested to see what was going to happen with this Corsmo subplot because Commander Shelby doesn't agree with pretty much anything that her captain does during this whole time, and I'm like, oh god, are we going to have a Last Jedi knee scene?
You're still really bitter about the Last Jedi. I think it's kind of cute.
Yeah, well,
and then to Tech Files in the live chat, there are 4 lights.
Yes,
I will always happily divert any conversation to there are 4 lights. So, one of the things that I thought was a great way to sort of display that conflict between Corsmo and Picard, mirroring the vendetta of Delcara versus the Borg, is what is the appropriate threat level. So the Borg is the scary entity, but there's this machine that eats planets that could potentially destroy the Borg. So of course, Peter David nails Picard is trying some sort of diplomatic solution because that's a weapon that the Federation could definitely utilize in their defense against the Borg, while Corsmo is only looking at that surface level threat of this thing eats planets, must stop that thing.
Well, he doesn't even understand the Borg fully because he basically ignores
Shelby there. Exactly.
He ignores all the experience that Picard and the Enterprise has had with the Borg because he thinks he knows better.
Or what Shelby has had. His first officer was Commander Shelby on the Enterprise during this entire thing, and he tries to come up with a diplomatic solution with the Borg. And
only Janeway can do that, and then go to prison later.
Oh man, Voyager, so good, so bad, all at the same time.
But and it's like I was a little disappointed with how they. I mean, I get it was Star Trek-y that he got to come back from he got a redeeming moment.
Yeah, he does get a redeeming moment, but they
I wish he'd been court-martialed.
Well, and you again, it's just sort of my one, post, the epilogue on this story should be, and then Corsmo was stripped of his command, because he tries to come up with a ceasefire with the Borg. Again, thanks to the Borg having assimilated a Ferengi, they deal. You're making a bargain with the Borg. This is hilarious.
I know. It's like all I wanted to hear was the Borg say it with all their like billion voices together, say human. But no, we didn't get that, unfortunately.
No, we didn't.
But yeah, it was. I felt like the Ferengi Locutus equivalent was a little bit silly, going through all the way to kind of the end. He was kind of a plot device more than anything, and they're like,
totally was.
I have him.
Vastador is right up there with I keep forgetting the Dantar. Dantar is the name of the Pensati.
Those are the two weakest characters in the book, I feel like.
If you weren't a bridge officer, then you were either fan service or a plot device. That is the failing of this book. I mean, coming back to it, there's so much that I love about this story. I love how it combines original series lore with Next Generation, and just the concept of a Borg antagonist is always going to be an exciting way to frame a story in the Star Trek universe. And I think this book accomplishes this so much better than future Borg adversaries. Like, what is it? Species
8472, the CGI, the early, like the terrible CGI people that weren't like enemies that weren't scary at all.
No,
they weren't more threatening.
What's way scarier? What's way scarier? Windsock and cement.
That's right. Yeah,
way scarier.
I mean, absolutely. Like it was just more rich because the ECVC's 8472. The only thing that made them more powerful than the Borg was they shot some sort of, their lasers they shot were more powerful.
That's not interesting. That's not really exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a whole lore behind it that they draw upon. And then Peter David builds upon, as we talked about, with the abusive manipulation of Delcara, and it culminates to make it just something that's just more satisfying as a Star Trek novel. I mean, heck, even in the do we want to start getting into the?
Yeah, let's go ahead and wrap up the story. Let's go ahead and spoil it.
So like they end up like how they end up, because part of this is essentially Delcara and Picard and Vastator end up on the Doomsday Machine, and they find Delcara's body, who's encased like in this crystalline magic whatever, and essentially she gets phasered and horribly mutilated, but not quite killed. Well, and then that last moment, Picard rejects her. There's been this whole love thing between them, but Picard was more in love with the idea of her. She is his Dulcinea.
Well, and once he realizes that he can't extricate her from this machine, that she's not willing to be removed from this position of power, that's when he realizes this isn't really the woman. Like, she's not what I fell in love with. I fell in love with this idea of a woman, and that's exactly what you're talking about, is the Dulcinea, the Don Quixote-ness of Picard's personality from being a young cadet and experiencing this. But that's also.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say
the way they handle, the way they don't destroy the Doomsday Machine, like, because she's dying, but so she decides she has to get to Borg space instead of, because she was content to get there eventually in 100 so years, but then she's got to get there in minutes. Well, in Star Trek lore, you can only go to warp 9.9. I guess in this book, 9.9.99, 9.99. Whatever.
It's that it's supposed to be this barrier that you can't break, the warp 10 barrier.
Yeah, it's theoretically impossible.
And this is where Next Gen, I mean, we reset the power creep, right? Because there are episodes of the original series of Star Trek where the Enterprise is like warp 14. But we've gone back and retconned that we changed up warp scale, that now it's this new logarithmic curve that, from warp 9 to warp 9.9 to warp 9.99 is an
when there's none of that scale in this at this point, because they directly say like the last one could only go to warp 4, and that was like, whatever. But like, I will say the way they handle going, because she ends up going, she's just through force of will gonna go beyond the warp 10 barrier, which theoretically you would be at every point in the universe
at once. Yeah,
and it's interesting because she just kind of disappears, and there are there are 4 separate chapters at least that are written exactly the same. There are 3 at least that are written. Yeah, there's 4 actually. They're written exactly the same because she gets into a sort of a loop where it's the idea behind it is if you are trying to step at a point that's a meter ahead, as Guinan describes it in her wisdom, if you're trying to step at a meter, like a point that is a meter ahead of you, but you only go half of that and then half of that again and that again, you're infinitely getting closer, but you're never going to arrive at your destination.
Exactly.
And it was such a Star Trek way to end that, and it's interesting too because she was it made me think of the same sort of fate, a similar fate to Let That Be Your Last Battlefield from the original series, where their choices they made, they allowed their obsessions to drive them to their own destruction. And she, where not Dulcinea, but Delcara is, she's mutilated to the point where like you wouldn't want to live like that, and she's bound to endure it for eternity.
Yeah, in her own personal sort of Sisyphean Greek torture, pushing her up the hill.
She doesn't even know it.
Eternity. This is from the live chat. Tech Files. There are 8 pages, so each one of these chapters is 1 page, and Peter David just keeps repeating that over the course of the end of this book. Over 8 pages of the book is sort of her last moments as she's breaking that warp 10 barrier. And then also just the question as to whether or not she actually got there. I loved the one character's description of, I've forgotten who described it this way, is what if it were similar to crossing the threshold of an event horizon, and because of relativity, your perception of time would be so horribly warped that you don't know if you would have ever gotten there, like ever been sucked into the black hole. Maybe you would exist in a weird sort of tangent of gravity, and you're like, yeah, that sounds totally Star Trek. And again, Peter David did this way better than Voyager did, because in Voyager, you break the warp 10 barrier and you just become a lizard.
Yeah, I know. You rip your own tongue out and turn into a lizard. I remember watching that episode, and I'm like, preteen, going, what is this that I'm watching? And I'm watching Space Cases at this point.
And then you're like, wait a minute, we got a problem here. Star Trek has totally jumped the shark.
Yeah. Yep.
But this to me really speaks, and I think I could understand why, because I haven't read the sequel to this, and I don't know that I've got it high on my list of books that I need to get to before I die. Let's bring up some weird mortality stuff there. I'm not going anywhere anytime soon that I know of. I think I'm in pretty good health. I just realized what that sounded like, and I'm not making any kind of weird admission on this podcast. This is one of the things that I think Peter David probably could have pointed to, and I think a lot of Star Trek fans could have pointed to, that we started having a problem with storytelling in Star Trek. There's so much baggage. There's so much canon. And then every conflict would be solved by an inappropriate use of tech jargon. You would have Trek speak that would get you out of danger in the last, I'll just reverse the polarity of the neutron flow. We make fun of that in a series like Doctor Who, where the hard science fiction-y elements don't really matter. It is space magic, the Time Lords. And it's supposed to be, because that's not really what's supposed to be important about the characters, the story, the conflict, and the relationships. Trek is always at its strongest when it's different groups of people and aliens working together to solve a problem. Trek is always at its weakest when the solution to that problem is a half a page of one character monologuing about, buzzard collectors and ram scoops and nacelles and dilithium crystals. That's never the solution.
Oh yeah, that and just that, and also a lot of times combined with just some sort of blow them up, violent sort of.
Yeah, or like what J.J. Abrams did to Star Trek, where they're fun space adventure films, but they're not good Star Trek. You've got great action sequences, and let's get the Beastie Boys playing, and that's super fun and cool, but that's not good Star Trek. Good Star Trek should be a little soapboxy, should be a little, I don't know what word I want to use there, but it should have more heart to it and more camaraderie to it. And more of a message to it, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's Star Trek as we know it. Well, I'm going to refrain on Discovery because since we need to give it more than a first season, since we had.
Well, but I just mean in keeping it within the sort of
Yeah.
general time frame of this era of Star Trek. This was always my biggest problem with Voyager was technobabble would save the day every single time, and you had a major problem where several times a season, oh, we've discovered this magical technology that could get us home radically faster. Oh no, it might do something bad. Should we use this technology? Should we go home? But at what cost? I guess we'll stay lost. And you'd end up where you started. Yep. Over and over and over again. So, like, you know, we're making fun of Voyager for their Warp 10 episode because it makes zero sense. Like, we broke the Warp 10 barrier. We could go and be in every single place in the universe in one instant, and we could just go home. But it screws with our DNA and turns us into lizard people. Or not even lizard people. It just turns us into lizards.
Which again, very specific.
Yeah, and from an evolutionary standpoint, doesn't make any sense from the common ancestors that we would have shared with other.
Right. I mean, TNG even approached this more appropriately in was it season 6 or season 7 where everyone de-evolved.
Yeah. Right.
You know.
Right.
Even it approached that more appropriately than we did.
Yeah. It makes zero sense, but then also it completely ignores, like, the show then completely ignores the fact that this plucky little starship crew had developed the technology to break the warp 10 barrier.
Right.
And that just never comes up again.
Yeah.
And they never think like, hey, you know what? We've fixed this. We can break the warp 10 barrier. We can do this. Maybe we should like do more testing and see if, you know, even if it's just we could send a message back to Starfleet on a shuttle that breaks the warp 10 barrier and doesn't have a person on it that's going to get turned into a lizard. Maybe that's like
put the doctor on there.
Well, that's exactly. So Star Trek Voyager keeps doing that thing where it's nothing matters. You get to the end of the episode and nothing changes for the crew. Nothing's advanced. There's no overarching like season-wide story that's really fulfilled from individual episodes. It's all just we're still stuck, lost in space. Danger, Will Robinson. We're Star Trek.
Well, and I won't go too much on Voyager, but I will say the ultimate culmination of that and representation of that in Voyager is the Year of Hell 2-parter where you just reset it, and that's and like the Voyager should have gotten back to the Alpha Quadrant in the same state that it was in Year of Hell, you know, where they and they never it's just squandered potential, and a lot of that is from my research has been from. It was directed from the top down, from the studio down. They couldn't change. It was basically they had to make it watered down TNG, and that really caused a lot of their problems. And that's why TNG stands up so well is because it was the pioneer of this. And one thing that makes this Vendetta so stick out in my mind, even though there are some crazy cheesy parts in it that just don't make any sense, or they're just ridiculous.
The core of it still survives as being very true to what I like about the storytelling of Next Gen.
Couldn't say it better myself. Yeah, like this was I thoroughly enjoyed the living hell out of this book. Like I was listening to the Star Trek scores in the background while I like TNG.
I love it.
I know. I have there's a YouTube like playlist if that's just Star Trek music that has a ton of TNG music that was in there that I was just listening to as I was reading this book the entire time, and it just fit perfectly. I felt like I was back in the prime of Trek in the 90s.
Yeah.
At that time, and it hit all of the nostalgia, the old school Trek nostalgia buttons for me. That
it really felt like right at that era, Trek Next Gen had found its stride. Seasons 4 and 5 really getting into its own. We were just before we were getting into Deep Space Nine. another example of like a Trek experiment that could survive without a spaceship named the Enterprise as one of the main characters. Like there was just so much to like about that era of science fiction storytelling, where I feel like some of that spirit has been reclaimed with, I mean, like The Expanse getting picked up again. You know, there's something really special about how that series, I mean, because we covered the first book, Leviathan Wakes, here on the podcast, and I'm finally catching up on season 2 of the TV show. I'm way behind. But there's something really special about science fiction which focuses on the story, and it's not a conceit. It's not like a Damon Lindelof, we're going to give you a whole bunch of rules, then break all the rules because, you know, your feelings are what really matter. It's that they're sticking to an established universe, but then they can still introduce a sense of the fantastic, a sense of something greater, or you know, a technology beyond ours, or what that might mean for our place in the universe. And it makes us ask those questions of, you know, do we matter, and why do we matter, and should we matter? And that kind of stuff is always been sort of the core of what I loved so much about Star Trek. And I feel like we're getting elements of that back into science fiction again, that we don't always have to make every single science fiction property accessible to a general popcorn eating audience in the most base level. You know, some of the complaints, I was making fun of you for it, you know, just your ire over The Last Jedi. But I think that is a conversation that I think studios are going to need to start acknowledging. Where does this fit in fandom? And how can you still maintain the canon? And how can you still respect the history of a property while still bringing new people into it? And that's a really difficult question. I don't think Star Trek could have survived without some reset points, right? You had the show from the 60s, several shows in the 90s, you had several movies. If you kept building on that lore, on that, you either would have watered it down so much that fans would have hated it, or you would have made the content so inaccessible that no one new could ever come to that property.
And I mean, that's why they skipped ahead 70 years for TNG, and why I think they should have done that post with Discovery. They should have jumped ahead another generation or two just to get clear of that, because by the end of the franchise, by the end of Enterprise and Nemesis, Star Trek was choking on its own continuity.
Oh yeah.
And it was
well, and look, their only solutions when you get into Insurrection and Nemesis was, can we make Star Trek more action oriented? And it worked for First Contact. You can't keep Star Trek there. Star Trek is so much grander a vision than just, you know, can we have more laser battles in space? You need to fill out diplomacy and conflict and resolution. And again, it all really does need to come back down to teamwork, you know, like getting people who are different from each other to work together on solving a problem. And so this is what bothers me about like where Discovery's going with their sort of in-between timeline, where maybe it's canon, maybe it's not, or I mean, maybe it's prime timeline, but it's probably not. And then the whole like J.J. Abrams offshoot of this completely different dimension of Trek, which I guess is dead now because
maybe depending on what, I don't know. I've heard conflicting things. Like basically, it sounds like at the studio there are competing visions for what the fourth Star Trek movie will be.
Well, but that's still, it's because we also have these weird like licensing splits, right?
That's true. That's true.
Get access to certain aspects of Star Trek. That, I mean, even down to things like uniforms. That's why Discovery has different looking uniforms than prime timeline Trek, is because they didn't have the licensing, because that went to another studio for a completely different property. So Star Trek is not in good care right now. It's too fractured. It's too split up. There's no good steward.
Why are you saying that you don't like basketball sneakers to be part of their official uniforms, or
we'll call them space shoes?
I mean, of course, like TNG uniforms weren't a huge amount better. I mean, for gosh sake, after this stream, I'm gonna have to go and somehow reach behind myself and unzip this damn thing, and get this thing off. So it's like they weren't much better. But I mean, funny thing, And I think I sent this to you before, the Will Wheaton story about when he met William Shatner. He talked about how they had like padding underneath these.
They had muscle suits under the
they had like little muscle suits under these, so that because like if you look at TNG and you, especially the front, it looks very flat and it's very pronounced, and you feel like it's a thick, heavy material. Nope, it's a muscle suit.
Well, and especially, and we totally see that transition happen too, from like the first season to the second season, where everyone looks like they're wearing space pajamas, to then like suddenly it's fitting a little different with the single zipper up the center.
Yes.
And then
that was
finally
the
get
first
to
season,
the
first two seasons, and then the rest were in the back.
Right. Well, and we actually had the sort of like Picard would like sort of tug at his shirt to get everything. The Picard maneuver would.
They referenced the Picard maneuver specifically in this book.
Peter David also calls out William Frakes. Or Jonathan Frakes, William Riker. There is one moment in the book, and I can't remember. I think I might even have it bookmarked. I can't be bothered to stop talking and look it up. It's where he describes the action of Riker straddling a chair from the back, which is the Riker maneuver. There's a great YouTube video where you can see someone like cut together every single time Jonathan Frakes sits down in a chair. He does this really awkward like swivel the chair, straddle it, sit back down thing, and he never just sits in a chair normally. He never just like sits at a table.
So I showed my girlfriend and I shared a viewing with my girlfriend for the first time because she'd never seen it, Best of Both Worlds, part 1 and 2, and then the following episode, and she made this great joke about how the reason why Riker never was taking the command is because he could never straddle the captain's chair on the Enterprise D. He could never straddle them, so he never took the command.
Now he needed an Excelsior bridge to pull that off. He needed the captain's chair to be more of a hood ornament.
So yeah, it needed to be more of an original series captain's chair where he could get his leg over it.
Not a high back. It's like again, it's like a 1960s automobile where if you get rear-ended, you're totally getting whiplash.
Yeah,
I love it.
Oh my god, yeah, so, Peter David knows how to write a Star Trek book.
Peter David totally nailed this for me. And I'm so happy to, because there have been so many other things, other properties, other movies that I've come back to, especially from this era of my childhood, just before I'm getting into becoming an edgier, more discerning media consumer. There are a lot of things that I look back on from when I was like 10 to 13. You're like, man, I was a dumb kid, but this one, for even the moments where I had to actually laugh out loud at some of the silliness of revisiting the Star Trek novel, the whole core of the story works really well. This to me totally could have been a 2-parter episode in the 4th season of Star Trek, and it would have fit in phenomenally well with that style of Star Trek storytelling. And I think it is kind of interesting to see how much pushback and how much resistance there was to some of the ideas in this book, which beat for beat, almost every single aspect of this story is later incorporated into future stories and future iterations of Star Trek. Like Peter David was well ahead of the curve, and I think he should be celebrated for that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a testament to his vision and understanding of Star Trek during this time and afterward and since, really, because it's a formula that's tried and true, and the concepts that he brought in really do work well. And I mean, I'm sure that the networking and whatnot behind the scenes with all this stuff, the word of certain things were made aware, like people were aware. Some people, at least somewhere, were aware of some of the concepts that Peter David brought forward from other bits of his work or his work with Star Trek novels.
And that absolutely nails it too, is when you said formula. So Star Trek has a very distinct formula, and throughout the entire run of the Next Gen, there are episodes that don't fully realize or live up to the potential of that formula. There are plenty of episodes that are really hard to watch that won't go down as fan favorites. Dr. Crusher falling in love with a mysterious doctor towards the end of the series.
I was exactly thinking of that one with the stupid space ghost and the little. Like I would like, oh my god, I'm thinking about this whole like
and
Code
so
of Honor is bad, but that one's even worse.
That one's so terrible. I mean, it's
there's
unwatchable.
No excuse for having that terrible of writing.
You just feel so bad for Gates McFadden because she is acting her ass off to try and make that piece of crap work to any degree, and like it totally doesn't. And I to this day I cannot finish that episode.
I can't either. You know, she changed her name when she joined the cast to Gates McFadden so that her theater friends in New York wouldn't recognize. It's a good thing she did because that episode was shameful.
Yeah, and not her fault.
It's not absolutely not her fault.
But
so I don't blame her for doing that move.
But that's also one of those things that I think is so important is there's a way to sort of honor a structure and honor a formula so that when it works really well. And it can be an exciting contribution, or at least a satisfying contribution to the overall canon of a franchise. I'll take it back to, the J.J. Abrams Star Trek or The Last Jedi. We're sort of in a holding pattern right now where people who don't understand what made those properties special or what made those franchises special are in charge of some very severe future decisions on how those franchises will be portrayed. And so I came to an understanding with general consumers and Star Wars fans, because I'm not a huge Star Wars fan. I like Star Wars and I love episodes 4 and 5. I adore episodes 4 and 5, but I was not into the expanded canon of Star Wars. So I sit down and I watch a movie like The Last Jedi, and I find it to be an entertaining story, a very emotional story. It hit me in all the right places for the feels, especially shortly after the passing of Carrie Fisher. Like, I was sobbing throughout multiple parts of that film, and it really worked for me. But then I totally appreciate why so many people are frustrated with it, because they sound exactly like how I sound when I describe someone like J.J. Abrams at the helm of Star Trek. J.J. Abrams had no business directing Star Trek when he was not only not a fan of it, but really seemed to dislike what Star Trek stood for. So in trying to appeal to a wider audience, you really went out of your way to crush what the fans thought was so special about each of those given properties. And you can't subvert our expectations out of that problem. You actually at some point need to buckle down and tell a story in that universe. And if you really don't want to be in that universe, then you should probably step aside and find someone who wants to explore that universe, or at least has some passion for that universe. Again, like Simon Pegg came into the writing on Star Trek way too late. There's a man that like absolutely adores what Trek stands for, but doesn't really get his attempt until the lowest of like the third film in that. And we're already watching, sort of the box offices dwindle because
well, and
you can't keep telling action combat Star Trek stories. It's just not really what
it's a guy who wants revenge, essentially. And it's essentially what happened was with the franchise was with J.J. Abrams' interpretation. Like, and I need to watch the 2009 Star Trek again because I enjoyed that one because it was kind of its own, at least before the other ones came out, because it was its own sort of thing. And it felt like Star Wars, but it felt like its own outlier until Into Darkness came, and that was more of a darkness overcoming Star Trek than meets the eye. And then Beyond was okay, but it still was, guy wants revenge.
And I've got a Doomsday MacGuffin.
And so basically it's a Doomsday MacGuffin. Like nice choice of words there without, but they and like it's Star Trek kind of stole its soul for wider audience appeal, and Star Wars. Well, I'd say Star Trek.
So here's my tinfoil hat Hollywood hypothesis. It's not so much that Paramount or the studios sold out Star Trek. They were looking for an exciting way to revisit this franchise. It's a property, since the 60s. It's a property that has instant recognition. So in this land of nostalgia and revisiting franchises and rebooting and stuff like that, Trek is prime. you don't need to explain a lot to get people. I mean, imagine trying to do a feature film of The Expanse and then Star Trek. How much more exposition you would need to associate the audience with to get into the world of The Expanse. The Expanse is an amazing TV show because you can owe that time to really exploring all of those concepts. With Star Trek, you've got decades of material that it's a cultural institution. Everyone knows Live Long and Prosper. Everyone knows Pointy Ears, Spock, Kirk, phasers will sleep with any alien female regardless of color.
Do you think that TNG is as ubiquitous now? Because everyone, like, do you think that people are going to know a Picard?
No, I definitely think that there are elements of TNG which have reached the same sort of cultural awareness. You know, they're pieces that make it so can be a joke that is widely accessible to people who were never really fans of Star Trek, of the Next Generation. Not quite so much as the original series, because you just have 2 whole extra generations of people that lived in between the Next Gen and the original series. But what I really felt happened was J.J. Abrams took Star Trek, made it this fun space adventure film, and inadvertently created his director's reel for Star Wars. He made the best Star Wars film I never asked for with the first Star Trek film.
And it would have been great to have basically that plot for The Last Jedi, just add some Force stuff, whatever, in there, but like have the same sort of like overall general sort of plot stuff. Would have been more original than what he ended up doing for Star Wars.
So what did he do? I mean, like, I kind of feel like he shot his creative wad on space adventure film on Star Trek.
And that's why, and it shows, because that's why I really still, even though it breaks, like, sort of breaks, it doesn't break canon as much as the other ones do, even though they're on their own thing. But like, that's why it stands out to me, is because the story was very compelling, even though there were plot holes, like getting from Earth to Vulcan in 0.68 seconds.
Or no, but also like being able to see a planet demolished in some other part of the galaxy. Why does J.J. Abrams think space is so close together? Like, no, it's right there, and I can watch as it crumbles.
I know, and it's the same thing with the stupid,
just like how you can see Mars with the naked eye every night,
right?
That's closer than any of the planets that we're talking about.
Well, we can see Mars. It's just not bigger than the moon usually.
Usually. Every now and then, just got a Mars flyby.
Yeah.
No, but that to me becomes the big problem. Is J.J. Abrams took Star Trek, tried to turn it mass market, but what does he know? J.J. Abrams is a filmmaker. I'm sorry, we're way off this book. This book is what we're talking about. I'm going to finish this thought, though. J.J. Abrams is a filmmaker, is an homage filmmaker. I don't believe he has his own style. And I don't want to take anything away from him, because I think he's one of the hardest working and an amazingly successful producer. But as a director, I don't know what a J.J. Abrams movie looks like. I know what a J.J. Abrams as Steven Spielberg movie looks like. I know what a J.J. Abrams as George Lucas movie looks like. So we get to the Star Trek film, and he's got a canon he's not familiar with. He applies more Star Wars style adventure to it, and that feels kind of like a fun, exciting romp. So then they're like, well, this guy knows space movies. Let's give him Star Wars. And what does he do? He basically just remakes episode 4. So we didn't get anything fresh. We didn't get anything original, because as soon as he actually had those characters, all he did was slap the same space adventure movie filter on it. And he's obviously a bigger fan of the George Lucas style space adventure film than he is of the Gene Roddenberry space adventure story. And so we ended up with a retread, but he had already sort of expressed his filmmaking space adventure commentary in the first Star Trek. Again, if we had just cut to the chase, I think we would have gotten a better episode 7 out of it. And hopefully someone else who had more attachment to Star Trek as a franchise would have been in charge of the Star Trek reboot. And there's an alternate dimension where that happened. And all of us geeks are way happier for that.
Yeah.
We're way more into that storytelling than what we currently have in this dimension.
Well, I mean, I thoroughly believe that we live in the mirror universe of Star Trek fandom right now and Star Wars fandom. Hence why I have the beard.
Sort of me too, but actually I need to trim. I'm looking really shaggy right now.
I tried to get it to Riker levels before this episode. Right before.
Oh, you've heard me say this before. I'm constantly going for the Jonathan Frakes, but I always end up at the Will Wheaton.
Like, hey, don't you know what? It's okay because right now with Jonathan Frakes, the last stuff I've seen, he's starting to look a little bit like old Baldy, you know, with by his name, by their, you know, they that's what they called him, Sir Patrick Stewart. But oh man, yeah, it's just goes to show like the complete different, the dichotomy of mindsets between modern Trek, because I'm bitter still, and I won't say real Trek, but like traditional Trek, and like this story goes big and epic, about as big and epic as you can with this property, with as it was at this time, but it still is more core Star Trek than what we've seen from the past decade with Star Trek, really. And that's one reason why I have such positive views from this, is just the sheer nostalgia of, and it's still got that soul, that old Star Trek soul in it, that I've sorely missed out of modern Trek. And I mean, I guess now I'm just gonna have to. This is going to be the outlet for the foreseeable future.
Trying to go back through the pocket novels. So this is one of the things, especially coming off of last month's book, Master and Commander, this is funny. I'm going to be kind of tying these two books together in a really roundabout way. So bear with me for just a second. But Star Trek adventurism should always feel like space sailing vessels. Should never feel like hot shot X-wing TIE fighters. That shouldn't be the feel of a Star Trek style adventure. It's you don't have one rogue hotshot pilot that can fly through all the obstacles and is a Mary Sue that can never get hurt. It should always be one person has a very specific job, and the entire mission might hinge on them executing that job, but they're one part of a greater whole.
Right.
And it should always be about teamwork and working together.
I mean, they got dangerously close with the Defiant on that, but then they blew it up at the end of this, you know, towards the end of the series. So like it did have some consequences, just as far as like when you're talking about naval vessels versus like flying around fighters sort of thing.
Well, and this is, you know, and as Star Trek, you know, moves through some of those different eras, they you know, like the whole Dominion War, I think, is an example of Star Trek getting dangerously close to losing that metaphor because they were trying to push, and technology was also improving for them to be able to put in special effects like that. There's a reason why, you know, especially early in the Next Generation, that space battles weren't particularly that visually exciting compared to what we have today. But because we had this conversation offline, and I really wanted to bring it back up again, kind of wrapping up that point and pointing it back to Master and Commander. We've got Discovery, we've got these other these other Star Trek properties, which may or may not ever happen at this point. Could we do a one-off Star Trek universe story, a film, or maybe like a limited run? Not like a TV show where we have an expectation that it's going to be season after season after season, but maybe like a mini series. Could we get to a point where maybe we could follow some other aspect of Star Trek lore in a way that we would celebrate a film like Das Boot?
Ooh, like
intrigue, espionage, trying to stay under the radar, or a crew on the run from a superior force, or something that still keeps us in the world of Star Trek. Do you think that we still have the patience for a story that might unfold with more intrigue and not rely as heavily on flippy action combat ships that always line up nose to nose with lasers and torpedoes flying all over the place?
Well, I mean, they kind of tried to do that with Star Trek Renegades, which they immediately were like, nope, it's not part of the lore, and they renamed everything. Like they tried to do it.
Because what I'd love to see, I mean, and it doesn't even have to be the Federation. I would love to see like a one-off story about Romulan secessionists.
That would be kind of interesting.
And so now you've got a group of people on the run trying to, you know, like get information out. It could be all about intrigue. It could be like backstabbing, political machinations, spy versus spy. There are so many aspects of so many of our franchises that we could tap into that. It's the problem that I see where we're trying to consistently out epic the last movie that came. This is a big problem I had with like the Nolan Batman films. The first two are amazing. The second one is so much grander and so much larger and so much darker and grittier than the first. And then the third, they try and top that. As opposed to maybe looking at, could we get a Batman storyline that's about him being a detective again? Not some, you know, talking, not some like, you know, just fan servicey, oh, look, he's doing detective work and now he raises an army to go fight Bane. Instead, where was like that Batman story where the Riddler is more of a character like John Doe from Seven, and Gotham is terrified, but it's not about raising an army or putting an entire city under siege, or the United States government has blockades surrounding Gotham. It's Batman has to unravel these clues to determine what's happening here, and it's more of a thriller than a giant action set piece after set piece after set piece. So it's so epic. Oh my God, it's so epic. And we can't get there with Marvel films now. We can't get there with Disney films now. Everything just has to be so big that nothing is really big anymore. And I would love to see any franchise. I think Star Trek would be perfect for this, of getting us back into a tiny, intimate story based on character, but then we can wrap it up in something that the stakes are very high. It's just, it doesn't have to be so big and loud and noisy.
Well, you know, I'd be happy if they took a note out of, took a page out of Star Trek 4's book and not have an actual protagonist, as it were. Like, don't have a malicious protagonist. I mean, not protagonist, I'm sorry. Malicious antagonist.
Yeah.
Yes. Like that would be that.
Well,
I think that would be perfect for, ironically enough, for a Star Trek movie. But
well, you know, again, it's the exploration, it's the unknown, it's people coming together to solve a problem and not knowing what, you know, what the motivations are. Again, this is Trek at its best. The Doomsday Machine and the probe from Star Trek 4, and you can do this really well. But even like Tech Files in our live chat talking about the undiscovered country, which I love that film, and I love that film because it's Trek at its best as a really on the nose metaphor for Cold War diplomatic relations between the United States and the former Soviet Union. Like they're not even trying to hide.
And that was
not even
the
clever.
Story was developing while this came out too. So
exactly.
Like it was perfect like absolute perfect commentary. It's probably up there with Wrath of Khan in my opinion.
Those are my top two. To me, it goes Star Trek 2, Star Trek 6, Star Trek 4.
Star Trek 6 was the first one I saw in theater, and I was scared out of my wits with the Klingons getting shot in weightlessness with the fake, really bad CG blood. That was
the Pepto-Bismol blood. Yeah. Well, funny how that didn't stay canon. The first one I think I saw in theaters, I was really, really young. Hold on. Was it Star Trek 3? Because that was the one with Christopher Lloyd.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I was a tiny little kid for that, and my parents took me to that. But anyway, that's to me, this isn't just a knock on Star Trek. This is a knock I feel on the spectacle and fury signifying nothing. You know, I sat Lex down and we were looking at just different movies, and she's getting into her own animated films, and out of nowhere she saw a commercial for Incredibles 2 and she started saying, I want to watch Incredibles. And you're like, okay. So me and my 2.5-year-old daughter, we sat down and we watched the original Incredibles, and she didn't get all of the mortality. Like, she didn't realize, like, oh, you know, a ton of people die in the Incredibles. But she like really started getting into the different characters, and Elastigirl, and Mr. Incredible, where's Mr. Incredible? Where's Mr. Incredible? And so, you know, we watched this film, and I just sat there watching just how good that story is, and really kind of how intimate and contained the threat is. There's a little element of thriller, of a mystery of who is this mysterious figure that's hiring Mr. Incredible. I mean, I don't want to go through the whole plot of The Incredibles. It's not what this podcast is about. But but like now, since then, we've sort of blown up filmmaking into this like this really aggressive march towards, again, trying to out epic our way out of problems. And I think we've lost some of those elements that made these original properties interesting. And we're in such a machine, in such a grind, trying so hard to churn out film after film after film after film, that I don't think anyone could really dedicate the care or the attention to detail under that context, under that kind of workload.
Well, you know, speaking of superhero films, X-Men really with Logan really did that right, because they had Apocalypse right before, which I haven't seen Apocalypse, which I've heard.
Oh, you need to hate watch that, dude.
I know. I've heard it's an absolute cheese fest, like crazy.
Because I really liked Days of Future Past. I thought that was a great way to reset it. Yeah,
I liked it as well. But the fact that they went with absolute crazy balls cheese out the window, you know, they followed up with Logan, which was, you know, a small story, almost pretty much a Western. You know, there was no giant blue laser going up into the sky. They had to stop to save the planet. It was just, it was a very small contained story. And that's something I feel like, going back to Star Wars, I have not seen the Solo film yet. So
I haven't seen Solo. My wife's going to see that tomorrow, I think.
I'm almost afraid to see it, but you know, I've got some level of Stockholm syndrome. So I'm going to go see it. But it's like, I really think, like, there are rumors that there's going to be an Obi-Wan Kenobi film. And I am a strong proponent in believing that it should not leave Tatooine. It should be small. It should not leave Tatooine. It should be like a Logan style, like a Western on Tatooine. And I mean, obviously, it won't be rated R, but you know, but
like, make it what was Obi-Wan doing in the interim, and you have this really great plot device. And how do you protect Luke without giving away your existence?
Right, and it could be. It has so much potential, and you have a greater link to the characters when a lot of times whenever you have these smaller scale stories, because you can pay more close attention to what motivates them and what drives them, and how things that unfold in the story emotionally affect them, and you can properly spend the amount of time concentrating on that instead of having to concentrate on the overarching epicness of the story.
That's what it was. It was a fault that I had with the end of Black Panther, was kind of falling into that same trap where you led me through this great film, characters disagreeing on selling weapons technology. There's a little bit of a James Bond element, and the sister is more of a Q-like character coming up with really cool technology. And you finally get to the peak of the conflict, and it just kind of devolves into a really shoddy CG action fest.
Oh yeah, I turned my brain off in the last 15 minutes.
I mean, I shouldn't have had to, because everything leading up to that was so smart for a Marvel film.
And I was super disappointed in the end. As soon as you saw the CGI rhinos running around, I'm just like,
so this is again not related to the book that we're podcasting about this month at all. This is my how it should have ended, where they make this big play. I'm going to spoil the ending of Black Panther for you inadvertently here, and I apologize, but you're going to get over it, because, like, you know, if this podcast gets more than 1,000 downloads, I'll be shocked. It's getting into the end. They make this big play out of how the mountain people won't fight with them, which we know that's not really going to be the case. But they finally get back, and T'Challa says, you know, I'm not dead. The challenge hasn't been completed. And instead of having everyone fight everyone, there should have been a standoff between the two warring factions. There should have been that tension, but no combat, because they have a society that's built on this lineage, that's built on passing the mantle of Black Panther from person to person. So we should have seen them complete it. And just when, you know, T'Challa and Warmonger are fighting, you know, the two warring factions, the two differing factions are getting closer and closer. It's getting tighter and tighter that, you know, they might actually come to combat. That's when the mountain people should have come in, not to fight, because he said he was not going to fight for them, but it could have had this amazing moment of them writing in to stop the other factions from fighting, saying, you will honor your traditions. We will make sure you don't become hypocrites.
Yeah. Well, you know, that is the type of respect and like respect and restraint in storytelling that
just doesn't exist anymore. It's like you can't trust the audience to go with you on that journey anymore.
Right. Well, and that's one thing that was so refreshing about this book, because this is from the era of storytelling where restraint was the kind of the name of the game, and it really shows for the quality and how this. I mean, as I said, there are certain aspects that don't shine, but for the most part,
definitely some cheese.
Shine. There's some cheese. There's some cheese, but I mean, sometimes cheese tastes good. You know,
well, most of the time cheese tastes good. Right. Just that cheese should also complement a more well-rounded culinary experience, and thankfully,
well, you know, this is more well-rounded than some of the schlock that we've seen today recently. So, in my opinion, it's just kind of it's interesting seeing how it's digressed.
I think we can wrap this up because again, we're kind of coming to that 2-hour mark. Yeah, we derail a conversation. We have so much more Star Trek that we should be talking.
Oh man. It's we're both like basically memory alpha memory banks for Star Trek lore. So.
Well, that used to be sort of the hallmark of being a Trekkie, was like having to memorize all this stuff because we came up when the internet was just becoming a thing. So I actually want to thank you for letting me pitch this as sort of the revisiting episode, the Juan's childhood episode. I was really nervous about walking into this, and I'm so happy that this book does live up to some of those 11-year-old me memories of why I loved this story.
Well, yeah, thanks for suggesting it, because like I've been wanting to read one of these really well, but I've heard kind of mixed things about some of them, and
yeah, I don't think we're going to get to Imzadi anytime soon. I don't think we need to cover a Star Trek romance novel.
No, I'm good. Well, it's like I was looking at some of the others, because I read a DS9 novel that was. It was okay, but it didn't really feel that people were caricatures and whatnot. And I've heard that some of these books are hit and miss, and I'm glad that I actually got to read a really good one, and one by Peter David, who has influenced me in ways like my childhood in ways that I didn't even realize. You know, it's just such a pleasure to be able to have another TNG story, especially when it's combined with one of my favorite TOS stories. So.
Well, and combined with one of my favorite TOS stories, and I think does a decent job of capturing some of what made my favorite villain so scary. So all of these things fit together in a very unique way that still feels like a warm, comfortable, well-worn duvet. You know, like you can kind of wrap yourself up in this story, just like you would revisit any of your favorite Star Trek The Next Generation episodes, streaming them on some service. This fits in there in a very similar way. So I would highly recommend, even though we've totally spoiled this book, most of the Star Trek films, Rian Johnson's directorial turn at Star Wars and Black Panther, I would still recommend giving Vendetta a shot, just because I mean there's a lot more to the story than what we detailed plot wise, because I hate podcasts that spend an hour and a half just going, and then the character says this, and then this guy says that, and then they do this, and then they fight. So we should get into what's going on next month. We do have a book picked out for next month. This is a 2014 National Book Award finalist. This is another book recommended to me by my sister. So my sister Christina, and my brother Marcus, and my brother-in-law Tony recommended The Three Body Problem. So
great book. That's so much fun.
That was an amazing recommendation for our podcast. So they earned some solid cred, and my sister sent me a copy. This book is Station 11, written by Emily St. John Mandel. Station 11, it's not that long. It's what? Hold on, I've got it here, like 330 pages, dripping wet. So not a really long read. I am about 60 pages into it right now, and this is already a very emotionally challenging read. And just to give you that little tease getting into it, it follows performers in a post-apocalyptic United States. So a super flu has wiped out the population, and we follow a band of Shakespearean actors who are going from wasteland town to wasteland town, and also trying to find other members of their troupe who they've gotten separated from. And even in the first 60 pages, there is a beautiful quality to how terrible this landscape has become. So I don't want to get too more into what, because we're going to be talking about this next month, but already this is going to be an emotionally challenging read in probably the best possible way. And there are already parts of this that I'm going to liken to how gorgeous and terrible the 3-body problem was for that experience too. So I'm very excited about next month's book.
I'm pretty excited too. You know, I've been kind of getting back into Fallout, like,
yes!
you know, though
yes!
I'm sure this is going to be much closer to the road than Fallout, probably. Yes! So, but you know, I'm up for a change, going for some post-apocalyptia. I mean, we've had some dystopian futures, but we have never had any post-apocalyptic.
So you know, we covered our nautical history book, and I don't feel I represented that book very well in our discussion. We've covered a lot of space, and a lot of action and a lot of combat, revisiting some Star Trek. That's always going to be fun. So this is, you know, a book that opens up similar to like Stephen King's The Stand, and then just being the theater nerd that I am, you know, growing up having been a theater kid, there's just something so amazing about this concept of, you know, what could the arts survive an apocalypse? And so that's this is gonna be a book right up my alley. But I can tell you the writing here is so lyrical and is so emotionally accessible. Parts of the story before we even get to the apocalypse are already emotionally gutting, and I'm already drawing those conclusions. You know, like being a parent, I'm already drawing those conclusions. Like, what if I didn't survive, but my 2-year-old daughter did? and it ties into some of the character development on some of the characters that have already been introduced. So, Station 11, Emily St. John Mandel. This is going to be our book for June for the Geek Book Club. Definitely go pick up a copy of it, or hit your library, or I mean, I'll add a link to the show notes on this video where you can purchase a copy if you want to do that too. But we're also big fans of supporting your local library on the Geek Book Club.
By the way, it's worth noting this is a National Book Award finalist. So yes.
And then I also want to think, like, I think it won some other award the year it was published too. I don't know if it was Hugo, but I'll have to look that up too. We'll have better notes for when we're actually talking about that book. And I promise you that when we're talking about Station 11, I won't go and spoil the ending of Infinity War. How about that? For no good reason, I won't just start talking about random other movies.
If we manage that, that'll be I would be really interested in seeing how that stretch goes.
That will be an amazing circuitous. I mean, because I totally believe that there will be some end, because you already brought up the road, you know. So, what is his name? Cormac?
Viggo Mortensen?
McCarthy? What is
the actual author?
Yeah. So I was like, I already feel like there are going to be some parallels in our discussion talking about that. So maybe we'll spoil. Okay, here it is. For Station 11, I promise you we will spoil the ending of the road, just so that we can talk about Station 11 and how it's different and probably better. How about that? That's the promise I'll make to you right now. But we'll lay off your favorite Marvel franchises and not divert the conversation as far away from the book as we did this.
Well, it's with Star Trek. There's so much to the multiverse. It's hard not to.
Because there's probably I really do faithfully believe that Time Lords are the Federation from the future.
Well, you had the.
No, I'm serious. The TARDIS is all about warping space. So if you can make a warp bubble around a ship to have it travel faster than light, why couldn't you also make a warp bubble in the ship so that your ship would be really, really small, but you would still be able to have like a whole crew on the inside of the ship? So that's bigger on the inside. That's Time Lord technology. Yeah. Eventually, the Federation is going to become Time Lords.
But then they decide to go with 20th century, early 21st century police box, or 20th Century Police box.
Oh, that gets explained too, because the chameleon circuit gets damaged. But I digress.
Yes.
That's this month. That we're done. We're now getting into Doctor Who, Star Trek fan fiction crossovers. I'll find a way to make that canon before I die. But we have wrapped this month on the Geek Book Club. Again, thank you so much to the people joining the conversation, the folks in the live chat, Stephanie Carlson, Tech Files. Had some earlier chat that I can't quite find other people like Floodlaw,
Diva Prem, and Link 057.
And Gansey Tech Nerd was joining into the conversation too. We really appreciate all you folks tuning in to just geek out over some good books with us. And don't be shy. Don't be afraid to join us on future books. We tell you the book ahead of time, so you have about a month to read it, and hopefully that's enough time. I failed on Master and Commander, so I don't want to see that happen to you folks doing the same thing. So next month, Station 11, and in between that time, we're going to have all of these the audio versions of the podcast available on our RSS feed. There will be links for that in our show notes also. And you can also catch us around the internet. Andrew is his personal Twitter is @FatProduce, and he also helped set up and manages the @TheGeekBookClub on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. You can reach out to us there. He's sharing photos of local bookstores. It's a really great, really great look at just, fun visits to classic bookshops and libraries and what we like to do here on the Geek Book Club. And of course, you can follow me around the Twitters and the Instagrams as @SomeGadgetGuy. We're going to be back next month with the great read, another great read. We always have great reads for you, so I hope you'll join us next month too. And this is the end of the Geek Book Club. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next month on the show.
Engage.
Make it so. And then hug on shirt. And Picard maneuver, but not the cool Picard maneuver with like the warp drive and the constellation and stuff. It's the sort of lame Picard maneuver. The Riker maneuver is better.